All right, so Chapter 11, Section 1 here review. We've got up our review worksheet, and so we'll kind of just go through this real quick, and a lot of these were fairly straightforward. So if we look at the long-term causes of World War I, hopefully you remember Maine, militarism, the alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism. For your test, you will need to know a basic definition for those as well, but know that those were kind of the long-term things that were going on in the world that kind of set the stage for the immediate cause, which was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Black Hand. In 1914, Europe was divided into two basic alliances. We have the Triple Entente, which they become the Allies. That's Great Britain, that's France, that's Russia. And then we have the Triple Alliance, or the Central Powers of Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, or Schleifen Plan, was Germany's plan to try to avoid war on two fronts. They had Russia to the west, they had Russia to the east, and they had France and Great Britain to the west. And so they viewed Russia as a bigger threat, so they wanted to knock out France first. So that was their plan, to go through Belgium, quickly drive on the capital of Paris and take care of France, and then they could focus all their efforts on Russia. We know that didn't go to plan, so to speak. If we look at trench warfare, our notes, we had a diagram, but the big thing with trench warfare is know that it led to a lot of death. It led to not a lot of death for not a lot of ground. They would dig into these trenches. The conditions in those trenches were oftentimes very poor, so just not good things there. If we look at what motivated those who opposed entry in World War I, again, we have all kinds of different motivations. There's socialists who view the war as kind of being an evil war of empire, and they just did not. It thought it was kind of a capitalistic struggle between two kind of powers. You have pacifists who believe that all wars are evil. You have conscientious objectors who oppose the war on moral grounds. Then you have those that are oppose the war because of their country of origin, where they came from. If we look at what motivated those who favored entering the war, those would be those ideas of just having a stronger connection to Great Britain, common ancestry, those types of things, and then also just the fact that there is kind of a stronger economic tie with those allied nations as well, especially Great Britain. If we look at what factors increased American sympathy for the Allies, it has to do with unrestricted German warfare, just a lot of submarine warfare, a lot of what Germany was doing. If we look at the threat of Germany sinking all the ships in British waters, the idea is it was questioning and harming the United States neutrality. And so when Germany kind of threatened to sink all ships, the United States is going to have to do something. The Zimmerman Note, that's a vocab term. Hopefully you know kind of what that was. It was a proposed alliance between Germany and Mexico, which was intercepted by the United States, which again causes for a little bit more outcry against Germany. So we're going to move on to section 2 here and try to get through section 2 fairly fast. So we'll get rid of that. Section 2 also looked kind of at the war on the home front, I believe. And with the United States raising an army, remember we talked about how the United States was not really prepared to go to war at the start, and they had to kind of do everything kind of from the start. So as far as raising an army goes, they instituted a draft. The Selective Service Act did that. They had a War Industries Board that went into and that's not really in this section, but they had a War Industries Board that increased mass production techniques. There was a whole list of things, and there was a slide on your notes that kind of explains that. but they did a lot as far as trying to encourage people to enlist, those types of things. Um, as far as how did the United States increase ship production, that again is on a slide in your notes. But it looked at exempting ship workers from the draft, encouraging people to get into the ship working field, shipbuilding field, and those types of things. The convoy system again helped the United States protect the goods that they shipped to Europe and their troops. And it significantly reduced the amount of ships that the United States lost on the way to Europe. Who led the American troops in Europe? This is pretty straightforward. The troops in Europe were called the American Expeditionary Force, and they were led by General John J. Pershing. And remember, we talked about how he kind of had a Nebraska tie. What new weapons were used during World War I? There were some new kinds of mechanized warfare with the machine guns, airplanes, tanks, as well as we talked about some chemical warfare that was used with mustard gas, those types of things. Medical services were also very important. So we looked at how did medical services respond to physical and emotional wounds suffered by soldiers. We talked about the Red Cross and ambulances, playing an instrumental role. But also we talked about kind of just new things that today we would call PTSD, like shell shock and battle fatigue. And certainly those were problems. We did not spend a great deal of time looking at the battles U.S. troops were involved in, but Section 2 mentions a few. The big one probably is the Battle of excuse me, I lost my place here. The Second Battle of the Marne, Chateau Thierry, places like that, but there are no kind of direct questions on your test that ask about battles, so we won't worry about that. 16, what caused the collapse of Germany? Again, it was kind of they were tired of fighting. There was a mutiny, and that mutiny kind of spread to the point that the capital of Berlin was kind of captured by some revolutionaries, and they declared a republic, and then a few days later they surrendered. This kind of all happened after Austria-Hungary had surrendered, and they're just basically too tired of fighting. They're too tired to continue fighting. Number 17, what was the final death toll, or how many people died? It was, up until its point, the bloodiest battle or the bloodiest war in our history. We had about 22 million deaths, half of which were civilians. So that's kind of a big, significant deal too. The United States, however, did not see huge numbers of casualties. Remember, they suffered actually the fewest numbers of casualties, at only 48,000 casualties actually due to the war, and a lot of that was because the United States didn't join the war till the kind of very end of it. So we'll move on to Section 3 here. Why was the War Industries Board established? Well, it was established to shift kind of from a peacetime economy to an economy that was focused on the manufacture of war goods. So how did the war affect the U.S. economy? Well, it kind of depended on a couple of things. If you were a factory that produced a war-type good, you did very well. But at the same time, prices went up, those types of things. And so we looked at kind of overall, most industries are going to see a bump, though, because of the war. How did U.S. civilians respond to the war? Well, many of them are going to contribute in some way, shape, or form. We talked about, people sacrificing, doing gasless Sundays or meatless nights, lightless nights, those types of things, planting victory gardens, buying victory bonds. There's lots of different things there that people did to help in the war effort. As far as the government and how they financed the war, remember Only about a third of the war was paid through taxes. The rest of it was paid through the sale of Liberty bonds and Liberty loans, which are essentially the United States people loaning money to the government. Those types of things. So if we look at anti-immigration hysteria during the war, again, unfortunately, this happens. World War II, we'll talk about how we interned Japanese citizens. Essentially the same type of things are going to happen here. You're going to see anti-immigrant sentiment against the Germans in Austria and people from Austria-Hungary and those parts of Europe as they, represent kind of evil in the war. The Espionage and Sedition Acts, again, those made it illegal for people to say bad things about the government, basically, or the war effort. People could be fined up to $10,000 and spend 20 years in prison. And essentially what they do, and again, this is important, there's a distinction you have to make here on the test. They don't repeal the First Amendment, but they threaten your civil liberties as represented in the First Amendment. They, severely reduce your freedom of speech and those types of things. The Great Migration is just the movement of African Americans from the South into northern cities. Again, the shift kind of had started before the war, but as you have these Jim Crow laws in the South, more and more are going to try to escape those Jim Crow laws, in the South. Again, we looked at reasons why they would, look to go north. Again, they're trying to escape racial discrimination. They were also looking for, jobs in factories and those types of things that northern cities offered a lot of. And so that's kind of where they ended up. Women also took on new roles and were provided new opportunities. They took on many jobs that men used to do or were traditionally a man's job. And ultimately, you are going to have women winning kind of the right to vote as a result of a lot of their efforts in the war. If we look at the effects of the worldwide flu epidemic that erupted during the war, again, this kind of started in the fall of 1918. So the very end of the war, we have this flu epidemic that breaks out. In our army bases, you have unsanitary conditions where the flu can spread quickly, and then when these soldiers return home, it starts to spread very, very quickly. And so, it spread it more rapidly, and many people are going to die as a result of it. So those are quickly the worksheets that you were assigned. I did not assign you the Section 4 worksheet, but I'm going to pull it up here and go through a couple of things with you because there are a couple things that I think are important on here that you'll want to know or at least look at. So, we talked a lot about Wilson's 14-point plans, and it was his plan for peace. It was his plan that he presented to Congress, not to Congress, but to the other Allied leaders at the peace conference. Again, Wilson is all about peace with no victory, or peace without victory. He didn't really want to punish Germany, so that means he would have been, certainly against a war guilt clause, and he would have had a little bit of a different view on reparations and probably wouldn't have wanted to punish Germany as hard. And that's really why the Allies reject Wilson's peace plan, why they reject most of his 14 points, because it doesn't punish Germany hard enough. So in a minute, we're going to look at the kind of differences between the Treaty of Versailles and the 14 points, and so hopefully that'll help you kind of pull some of those things out. But when we looked at the weaknesses of the Treaty of Versailles, we looked at a couple of ones. One, that it was just way too harsh on Germany with the reparations and forcing them to admit that they're guilty. And the other kind of significant weakness is it wasn't inclusive. It didn't include any of the smaller Allied nations that helped in the victory, and it also didn't include Russia. So that's fairly significant. Most Americans, when the treaty is brought home, they are going to have some mixed feelings on it. Many are going to be leery of some of the provisions, especially things about the League of Nations. Um, and again, the disagreement here in guys like Henry Cabot Lodge, it lies in the fact that people think that this league is going to draw them into more conflicts in Europe. If you're in the League of Nations, you could get you're tied to them essentially. Um, Germany obviously is going to be not a fan of the treaty, and that goes to the idea that Germany is harshly punished. They have to pay so much. They say, hey, it's going to cripple our economy, and they're forced to admit that they were guilty for the war. And as such, the Germany that kind of emerges from World War I is one that is severely crippled, one that has some resentment about the way things ended and ultimately are going to lead to problems in the future in World War II. We look at the United States. As the United States emerges from, the war, their emergence as a world power accelerates, and they are going to become a world power as a result of their activity in World War One. Number 17 is about the legacy of World War One, and there are lots of things we looked at as far as the legacy. There's a slide in your notes. I'd encourage you to go look at it. But like we said, the United States does kind of contribute, or does kind of emerge as a world power. And those types of things. So there's legacies within the United States. There's global legacies, things that you're probably going to want to go look at, or look at section 4 in your book. Make sure you know some of the legacies. So like I said, I would go back and kind of go over, and we did this in class, and we know that there are some questions on your test that asks you compare the two things. Again, like I said, Wilson's 14-point plan is a plan that he comes up with on his own. It's just a plan. It is never voted on by Congress. People don't have strong feelings towards it because it's not binding in any way. The Treaty of Versailles is what the Allies are going to hammer out, and each one of the big four, and again, it's something we should probably mention too, the big four being the United States, France, Great Britain, and Italy, are going to bring their own ideas to the treaty. We did this in class and kind of looked at, okay, what were their different ideas. So if you look at the 14-point plan, we talked about dividing it up into a couple of different categories. The first several things in the Treaty of Versailles dealt with, ending secretive alliances, having freedom of the seas, lowering trade barriers to have free trade, reducing armaments, and things like that. And then the next several were about kind of redrawing the map in Europe, something we called self-determination. And then the last point was the League of Nations. Those were Wilson's 14 points. Wilson takes that to Versailles, and he basically compromises on all those other points to get the League of Nations included. So really the only thing that we could say is the same for both of them is the League of Nations. However, there were different things that kind of were included in both. And again, if you look at your Kahoot, those are the things that you would need to know. But again, there's no war guilt clause in the 14-point plans. There's nothing about reparations in the 14-point plan. Those types of things. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles is rejected by the U.S. Senate. It's voted on and rejected by the U.S. Senate because of the League of Nations, which again is kind of ironic because that's what Wilson wanted in it, probably the most. So I encourage you to go back, look at that Kahoot 1, 2, 3 more times, and be able to answer those questions. In addition, um, your short answer questions on your test, it's important that you be able to tell me why the United States entered the war, and be able to give me at least 2 reasons why the United States would have entered the war, and be able to explain those 2 reasons. So you could talk about unrestricted submarine warfare, you could talk about the Zimmerman Note, you could talk about the Russian Revolution and how that affected the United States entering the war. So you need to be able to explain 2 of those reasons. You would need to be able to tell me some ways in which immigrants, African Americans, and women were affected by the war. So African Americans, Great Migration, that kind of stuff. Immigrants, the anti-immigrant sentiment, and why that developed. And then with women, obviously their contributions, and then ultimately getting the right to vote. So being able to explain those things. And then the weaknesses of the Treaty of Versailles. You kind of already mentioned the fact that Germany was treated harshly, and then the fact that it didn't include the smaller allied nations in Russia, and ultimately kind of how that was a weakness. So again, go back, look at the Kahoot. Hope this helps.